At 2 a.m. in the morning, on a nameless patch of mud and jungle on Guadalcanal, the future of the Pacific balanced on one man who had no idea history was watching him. He wasn't a general with a map. He wasn't in a headquarters tent. He was a 24-year-old platoon sergeant, soaked to the bone, crouched behind a Browning machine gun that was already slick with rain and sweat. Somewhere out in the darkness, hundreds, maybe thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving through the jungle toward him. Behind his position, just a short march away, lay a hastily carved-out airstrip called Henderson Field. If that airfield fell, the bombers parked on its muddy runway would never fly again. If those bombers stopped flying, Japan would regain control of the sea. And if Japan controlled the sea, everything America planned to do in the Pacific, every island, every landing, every push toward Tokyo would suddenly look impossible. None of that was written on any order packet in Paige's hands. All he knew was simpler and much harsher. If this ridge broke, men he knew by name would die behind him. The line would fold, and the enemy would roll straight over Henderson Field before sunrise. And tonight, on this ridge, the weakest point in the perimeter, the man holding the trigger was Mitchell Paige. To understand why this ridge didn't collapse, you have to understand the man behind the guns. Mitchell Paige was born in 1918 in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, the son of immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic, chasing a life with a little less fear and a little more opportunity. He didn't come from a line of famous officers. There was no destiny stamped on his birth certificate. What he had instead was something more dangerous, a stubborn mind that locked onto one discipline and refused to let go. By the time most young men his age were thinking about their first job, Paige had already walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office. It was 1936. The world was sliding toward war without fully realizing it yet. He signed his name and stepped into a culture that worshipped discipline, repetition, and mastery. The weapon that became his world was the Browning M1917, a water-cooled 30-caliber machine gun that looked less like a rifle and more like a small, portable storm. It weighed almost 100 pounds with its tripod, before you added ammo or water. It wasn't something you casually slung over a shoulder. It was a system that normally needed 3 men and tight coordination: gunner, loader, ammo bearer. Get the rhythm wrong and it jammed. Feed the belt badly and it choked. Ignore the cooling jacket and the barrel warped into useless metal. Most Marines had months to learn it. Paige had years. 6 full years of drills, ranges, hot barrels, and jammed belts. He learned how the gun felt when the water jacket was just about to boil. He learned how a wet ammo belt dragged differently through the feed tray. He learned to clear malfunctions in the dark by touch alone. By 1942, the Browning wasn't just a weapon in his hands, it was almost muscle memory, an extension of his own nervous system. And then came Guadalcanal. In August 1942, the United States launched its first major offensive of the Pacific War by landing Marines on a jungle-covered island most Americans couldn't find on a map. The prize was an unfinished Japanese airstrip that the Marines renamed Henderson Field. If the U.S. could hold it, their aircraft could strike Japanese ships and reinforcements. If they lost it, the Pacific might slide back into Japanese hands. The Japanese understood that perfectly. So did every Marine digging foxholes into that wet, volcanic soil. By late October, both sides were exhausted, sick, and stretched to the limit. That's when Japan made its big move. Along a hacked-out jungle trail called the Maruyama Road, thousands of troops from the Japanese 17th Army pushed through ravines, rivers, and mud with one goal: hit the perimeter around Henderson Field, crack it open, and erase the American presence from Guadalcanal in a single, decisive blow. On the southern side of that perimeter, staring into a wall of jungle, the man in charge of one thin slice of defense was Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige. On a map, the ridge Paige defended didn't look like the star of the show. It was just one of many humps of ground thrown up by the island's geology, a shallow rise overlooking a slope that fed into the thick jungle. But in reality, it was a doorway. If enemy infantry could push through here, they'd have a straight shot toward the airfield. During daylight, Paige walked that ground over and over. He measured distances with his eyes. He counted paces. He noted every tree, every depression where an enemy squad might crawl unseen, every line of approach that would make sense to a Japanese officer who wanted surprise and speed. Then he set up his answer. 4 Browning M1917s went into scraped-out positions along roughly 1,500 yards of ridge, overlapping fields of fire like interlocking fingers. He didn't just scatter guns randomly, he arranged a kill zone he could picture even with his eyes closed. Each gun covered not just a segment of open ground, but specific likely assault routes, that gap between the trees, that wash where a platoon might funnel, that corner of barbed wire an engineer with a satchel charge would love to blow open. The guns were heavy. The tripods were heavier. The ammo cans felt like bricks of lead after an hour of humping them through mud. But Paige pushed his men until every position felt right. Then he added his own low-tech early warning system. In front of the ridge, hidden under ferns and tangled roots, Paige strung a rough tripwire and tied up empty ration cans with a single spent cartridge rattling inside. No electricity, no fancy sensors, just metal on metal. If someone touched that wire in the darkness, the cans would clatter together and give his machine gunners a few precious seconds before contact. Crude. But sometimes crude is all you get between you and oblivion. By 2 a.m., on the 26th of October 1942, the ridge was soaked with rain, the air was heavy, and the men of Paige's platoon were more awake than they had ever been in their lives. They had already heard Japanese voices drifting up through the trees. Cigarette embers glowed and disappeared. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled. The jungle was breathing. At 2:45 a.m., the cans finally rattled. Seconds later, Japanese artillery from the west began pounding the ridge, smashing trees and throwing mud into the air. Paige hunkered down as the ground shook around him, and shards of wood and steel slashed overhead. This wasn't harassment. This was the opening note of something massive. Through the breaks in the barrage, he heard it. Boots in mud, voices chanting. A rhythm of men moving in formation. The enemy wasn't sneaking anymore. They were coming like a hammer. At 3 a.m., shapes emerged from the tree line below dark lines of infantry. Officers with swords raised, soldiers lugging explosives to blast through wire. Paige gave the only order he had been preparing his whole life to give. All 4 Browning machine guns opened up at once. The sound was like ripping canvas amplified to thunder. Tracer rounds stitched the slope in long red streaks. Men in the first Japanese ranks folded and collapsed, their momentum broken. Behind them, more stepped forward, climbing over bodies, shouting, surging up the hill, straight into a zone of fire that had been measured and remeasured in daylight. The ridge erupted. Every tree Paige had zeroed in on became a reference point. Every bush he had memorized marked a range. The machine gun barrels heated, steam hissing off water jackets. Shell casings piled up under the tripods in bright brass drifts. The first assault broke apart in confusion. But it didn't stop. Japanese officers drove the men forward again and again. For every body that dropped, 2 more pushed past. Some soldiers sprinted with Bangalore torpedoes, long explosive charges meant to blast open wire and clear a path. Others crawled and hugged the ground, trying to find blind spots in the Marines' fire. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a full-scale attempt to tear the ridge right out of the American line. By 4 a.m., 2 of Paige's 4 guns were silent. Grenades had found their mark. Crews were dead or bleeding out in mud turned almost black by rain, and blood mingled together. The ridge that had seemed so densely manned an hour earlier suddenly felt full of holes. Paige moved through that chaos, low to the ground, ignoring the sting of flying debris. He shifted the survivors to cover the remaining guns, cleared jams with fingers that were already numb, slapped new belts into feed trays, shouted corrections over the roar. Somewhere in that swirl, a Japanese soldier lunged through the dark, bayonet catching Paige's left hand and tearing deep. Pain exploded up his arm. Paige reacted without thinking, driving his knife forward until the man went limp. Then he wrapped his shredded hand in whatever bandage he could improvise and went back to the gun. By 5 a.m., there was only one Browning left on that ridge still firing. By 5:30, when Paige scanned left and right between bursts, he saw something that would have turned most men's bones to ice. Every Marine in his platoon was dead or wounded. 32 men. For a heartbeat, the ridge was as silent as his own pulse. Then, somewhere below, Japanese officers started yelling new orders. The next wave was forming. Most weapons in war are designed around teams. The Browning M1917 was no exception. One man to fire and aim, one to feed the belt and watch for malfunctions, one to run water, carry ammunition, and keep the beast alive. Paige now had the same job but with no team. He had one functional gun in front of him, a damaged hand, and only rough guesses about how many enemy soldiers were still in the trees below. The truth would come soon enough. He grabbed the Browning like a lifeline. When the Japanese surged again around 6 a.m., the gun roared back to life. Each cloth belt held 250 rounds, barely more than half a minute of continuous fire. In those seconds, Paige had to make every shot count, sweeping the slope, forcing clusters of men to dive for cover, breaking the cohesion of the attack before it reached bayonet distance. The belt went dry. The gun chattered to a stop. He had to choose: watch them close the distance, or reload with fingers that barely wanted to move. He ripped a new belt out of an ammo can with his right hand, his left still bleeding and clumsy. He fed the belt into the tray one-handed while his eyes tracked moving shapes between trees. 40 yards, 30 yards, 20. The sound of boots in mud was loud enough now to feel. He slammed the cover down and yanked the trigger. The ridge exploded again. Men dropped. Others stumbled back downhill, dragging wounded with them. This dance repeated belt, fire, jam, clear, belt, fire, until the Browning had been pushed so far beyond its comfortable operating window that the barrel glowed under its water jacket. By 7 a.m., steam poured off the gun. The jacket was running low, and every pull of the trigger risked warping the barrel into scrap metal. Paige knew the manuals. He understood the engineering. Keep this up and the gun dies for good. But replacing it meant crawling into a battlefield littered with bodies and shrapnel, under fire, with nothing more than hope that another gun still functioned. Before he made that decision, he tried one thing. He grabbed an empty canteen and crawled to the nearest fallen Marine, praying there was water left on his belt. When he found a full canteen, he dragged himself back to the gun, unscrewed the cap, and poured water into the jacket. It boiled the instant it hit metal, steam erupting in bursts that smelled like hot metal and cordite. Again, more water, more steam. The gun cooled, just enough to buy him a little more time. But machines have limits, even in the hands of men like this. Sometime after 8 a.m., the receiver finally jammed hard. No quick clear, no simple stuck casing. The gun was done. Paige didn't hesitate. He abandoned that position, crawled along the ridge through churned-up mud and bodies until he reached the second gun pit, where another Browning sat over silent Marine uniforms. The crew was gone. The weapon was intact. He hauled it back toward his original position, dragging tripod and gun together like a single unwieldy animal. When the Japanese tried again at 9 a.m., he was waiting for them with a fresh barrel, full jacket, and the same cold determination. He should not have been able to keep this pace. Medical studies done long after the war would show that under intense combat stress, most soldiers' fine motor skills crater after a couple of hours. Decision-making starts to deteriorate even faster. 6 hours in, the body demands shutdown. But Paige wasn't reading medical journals. He was living off something more primitive, training so deep it bypassed conscious thought, adrenaline spiking again and again, and a refusal to quit that bordered on reckless. Hour after hour, he moved between positions, dragging ammo, dragging guns, dragging his own battered body to wherever the next assault appeared. At one point, when every canteen in reach had been drained and barrels were threatening to seize again, he resorted to one of those small, desperate acts soldiers don't talk about in polite company, using even his own body's fluid to get enough liquid into a water jacket to keep metal from tearing itself apart. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't heroic in the way medals show, but it was the difference between a working gun and a useless chunk of steel. By 11 a.m., he had been fighting essentially alone for 6 hours. The jungle was no longer just black silhouettes. The rising sun revealed the slope in front of his position in sickening detail. Bodies in uniforms, twisted in tangled heaps, scattered from the tree line almost up to his gun, hundreds of them. The Japanese finally paused, regrouping under the trees, out of range, plotting a way to finish what they had started. Paige used the break to crawl to yet another gun pit. One more Browning had survived grenade blasts and rifle fire. One more ammo cache lay open. He dragged ammunition back, checked his weapons, and counted what he had left. 2 functional machine guns, roughly 12 belts of ammo. Somewhere in that jungle were still hundreds of enemy soldiers. He had reached the edge of what one human being should reasonably be able to do. The problem was simple. The battle for Henderson Field didn't care about reasonable. Around midday, the Japanese changed tactics. Instead of one solid wave rushing straight up the gut, they tried to solve him like a puzzle, an assault straight up the center, another force peeling left through the jungle. Another curling right, 3 attacks converging on a single, exhausted man and a handful of freshly dragged guns. Their calculation was clear. He might stop 1 attack, maybe 2. But he couldn't physically put bullets into all 3 sectors at once. Somewhere, sometime, a flank would slip through. For a while, Paige answered with a kind of violent choreography. He used 1 gun on the central wave until they ducked for cover. Then he grabbed the second gun, swung toward the left, and raked the flank until it broke apart. When those soldiers scattered, he pivoted back to the center, then to the right, then back again. Short, vicious bursts, always making the attackers think there were more Marines up here than there really were. It worked longer than it had any right to. But officers on the other side weren't stupid. After 20 minutes, they figured out the pattern. Only 1 gun at a time, moving like a spotlight. They tightened their coordination. Their next push sent all 3 prongs forward together. Now, whenever Paige chose to cut down one group, 2 more advanced almost unopposed. Slowly, inevitably, the noose tightened. The right flank was first to break through, reaching the top of the ridge just far enough away to be lethal. They began setting up a small mortar, a weapon that could drop explosives right into Paige's position from relative safety. If that mortar started firing, it was over. He swung his gun and erased the team in a single brutal belt of fire. But by the time they were down, the center assault had crept to within 30 yards, close enough that individual faces, bayonets, and expressions of sheer determination edged into view. For the first time, Paige was losing the geometry of the fight. He needed more Marines, he needed more guns, he needed anyone to stand with him on that ridge. At around 1 p.m., he finally heard something he had been waiting for without letting himself admit it. American voices. 2 rifle companies from the reserves were moving up, led personally by a man whose name would become legend in Marine Corps history, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller. Puller looked at the ridge, at the dead Marines, at the hundreds of enemy bodies sprawled down the slope, and finally at this one machine gunner covered in mud and blood who was somehow still firing. He didn't waste time on speeches. He asked one simple question. Could Paige hold if he had more ammunition? Paige gave a simple answer. As long as the belts kept coming, he would keep shooting. Marines spread along the ridge, digging in, adding rifles and fresh machine guns to the thin line. Puller called in artillery, and within minutes, American shells began hammering areas where Japanese units were massing in the trees. For a moment, it looked like technology and fresh bodies might finally tip the balance for good. The Japanese tested that theory at 2 p.m. This time, they stripped away the clever flanking maneuvers and went back to the raw numbers game. Roughly 500 men surged straight up the slope, stepping over bodies that had been lying there since dawn. Artillery tore gaps in their ranks, but more poured through. Marine rifles cracked from the ridge. Machine guns chattered again. Still they came. At about 40 yards, just when the assault was hitting the zone where hand-to-hand combat becomes inevitable, Paige's gun jammed fatally. This time, there was no clearing it. Hours of continuous fire had finally broken the weapon beyond quick repair. He had been living this nightmare alone for most of the day. Now the entire ridge was in the same deadly equation he had been staring at since 3 a.m. Too many enemies, not enough firepower, and the last few yards of ground between survival and disaster shrinking fast. Puller made a decision that sounded insane on paper. If they stayed on the ridge and waited, the Japanese would reach them with full momentum, crashing into their positions with superior numbers. The line might hold for a minute, maybe two, then buckle and break. So he ordered something different. He told his Marines to fix bayonets. 40 Marines against roughly 500 Japanese soldiers climbing uphill. On a clean battlefield diagram, that math is hopeless. In the real world, with nerves stretched to breaking and the memory of 11 hours of failed assaults burned into minds, math sometimes loses. When Puller asked who would lead the charge, the man who had already given more of himself in the last 12 hours than most soldiers give in a lifetime stood up. Mitchell Paige grabbed his Springfield rifle, locked a bayonet into place, and stepped to the front. At 2:15 p.m., they went over the top. Marines sprinted downhill through mud and shell holes, yelling as they closed the distance, blades fixed, rifles ready to be used as spears and clubs. For a fraction of a second, the Japanese front ranks froze. They had spent almost half a day throwing themselves at this ridge, losing man after man to unseen guns and faceless defenders. Now those same defenders were charging them. That hesitation, 3 seconds, maybe less, was enough to crack something deep in the human survival instinct. Some soldiers in the front line decided they'd had enough. They turned, others followed. Orders and shouted commands collided with the urge to live long enough to see another sunrise. The front began to bend, then fold. Paige hit the Japanese line at a run. His bayonet found a target and drove home. When the blade stuck, he let the rifle go and drew his knife, moving on pure reflex: block, strike, move. Marines around him were locked in close combat. Bayonets, rifle butts, boots, knives, fists. The carefully drawn-up assault plan on the Japanese side dissolved into pockets of chaos and small groups of men trying to decide whether to stand or run. In minutes, what had been a 500-man assault became something else entirely. A rout. Japanese soldiers turned back toward the jungle, some still firing, most just running. Officers tried to rally them, waving swords, shouting, threatening, but fear has its own gravity. Once enough men started heading downhill, the rest followed. Paige and the other Marines chased them just far enough to make sure the break was real then. With Puller's orders ringing in their ears, they pulled back to the ridge. Charging too far would have flipped the script again, turning the hunters into overextended targets. Back at his position, Paige finally sagged behind his gun, body shaking, wounds screaming for attention. He had been awake for more than a day. He had been in combat for roughly 13 straight hours. He had held this ridge alone for 6 of those hours. And yet, even as Corman tried to bandage his torn hand and bleeding leg, part of his mind stayed locked on the tree line. They've always come again, he thought. Why would today be different? For the first time since the cans rattled around 2:45 that morning, the ridge stayed quiet. Half an hour passed. Then another. Patrols crept forward, rifles ready, moving cautiously down the slope that had been scrubbed by machine gun fire and artillery all day. What they saw there put raw numbers to the thing Paige had lived through, in noise and flashes. Japanese bodies filled the ground in front of his original machine gun positions, so many that Marines stopped counting individually and started estimating. In some accounts, roughly 473 dead in front of his section alone. Across the broader Henderson Field perimeter, historians estimate thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed during the October 23-26 offensive. For Paige's platoon, the cost was just as severe, but in reverse. Of the 33 men he had brought into those positions, 32 were now dead or wounded. He was the last man still able to fight. By 5 p.m., word came back from higher headquarters. The Japanese were withdrawing. The massive push to take Henderson Field had failed. The airstrip, the aircraft, the fuel dumps, the lifeline through the Solomon Islands, everything behind Paige's battered ridge was still in American hands. The battle for Henderson Field was over. On the ground, it looked like a single hard-won night and day of horror and exhaustion. On the map of the Pacific, it was something even larger. Up to this point in the war, Guadalcanal had been a question mark. Could the United States actually sustain an offensive thousands of miles from home, on an island dominated by disease, jungle, and enemy ships and aircraft? Could they protect an airfield long enough for it to matter? After October 26, that question began to look a lot more like an answer. Japan had thrown thousands of men at the perimeter around Henderson Field. They had used complex plans, night attacks, artillery, and every advantage they could scrape together from a shrinking logistical base. And still, the airfield stood. In the months that followed, the Japanese would fight on Guadalcanal with grim determination, but increasingly from a position of weakness. Their supplies were shredded by air attacks launched from the very runway Paige and others had fought so hard to defend. Their troops went hungry, sick, and exhausted. Eventually, they would begin quietly evacuating the island, acknowledging in action what they would not admit in words. Guadalcanal was lost. Strategically, this changed the entire war. America had proved that its combination of naval power, air power, and stubborn infantry could not just land somewhere, but stay. The island-hopping strategy that would carry Marines and soldiers across the Pacific from Tarawa to Saipan to Peleliu to Iwo Jima suddenly had a successful test case. If Henderson Field had fallen, the timeline stretches out in dark ways. Without the airfield, Japanese convoys run more freely. Reinforcements and supplies reach strong points that historically starved. American planners might think twice before launching the next amphibious operation. Commanders in Washington would have to defend a major, highly public failure to a country still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Maybe the United States pushes forward anyway, just on a rougher, bloodier schedule. Maybe it doesn't, and the war drags on years longer, costing tens of thousands more lives on both sides. We will never know the exact shape that alternate history would have taken. What we do know is that the path we did walk, one that led eventually to American bombers over Tokyo and Japanese surrender, ran straight through a muddy ridge on Guadalcanal, defended for 6 impossible hours by a single Marine who refused to let go of his guns. On paper, the Marine Corps summarized what happened on that ridge in 1 page of formal language. When the enemy broke through the line, directly in front of his position, it said he continued to direct the fire of his gunners until all his men were either killed or wounded. Alone, he fought his gun, then moved from gun to gun, never ceasing his withering fire against advancing enemy forces. Afterwards, he formed a new line and led a bayonet charge that drove the enemy back and prevented a breakthrough. Those sentences earned him the Medal of Honor, presented on the 21st of May 1943 in Australia. Paige put the medal in a box and mailed it home. Then he went back to war. He fought in other Pacific campaigns, Cape Gloucester, New Guinea, and served long after those early island battles had faded from the headlines. He stayed in uniform through the Korean War era and finally retired in 1959 as a colonel, with rows of ribbons and decorations that most men would have considered more than enough for one lifetime. But for Paige, the story of Guadalcanal wasn't something that ended when he folded his dress blues and put them in a closet. It followed him. He knew the 32 men who didn't come home from that ridge. He remembered their faces, their jokes, the way they had volunteered for thankless jobs, the way they had stood their ground while artillery fell and machine guns heated up. When he wore the Medal of Honor, he never felt like it belonged solely to him. It was a stand-in for 33 Marines, most of whom were now names on crosses and headstones. That made what he discovered in civilian life almost unbearable. In the decades after the war, as America tried to process the trauma of global conflict, and then new wars in Korea and Vietnam, another kind of phenomenon started to appear: fake heroes. Some people bought or stole medals of honor. Others simply lied, walking into Legion halls or parades, claiming they had received the nation's highest award for valor. They wore uniforms they hadn't earned, told stories that never happened, and accepted praise that didn't belong to them. For most citizens, it might have seemed like a strange, sad kind of fraud. For men like Paige, it was something much worse. Every time someone pinned on a fake medal, they were borrowing the blood of real soldiers and Marines. They were standing on the same symbolic ground as men who had fought alone on ridges, who had dragged wounded comrades out of burning vehicles, who had thrown themselves on grenades. They were, in a very real sense, stealing the currency of sacrifice. Paige decided that was a second war worth fighting. He became a special liaison for the Congressional Medal of Honor Society to the FBI, dedicating years of his life to tracking down imposters and people selling counterfeit medals of honor. When reports came in about someone claiming to wear the medal, or about stacks of them being sold like trinkets at gun shows, Paige dug in. He checked names against official rosters. He quizzed suspected fakes about units, dates, places, details that real recipients never forgot and frauds always seemed to blur. When he found a liar, he didn't sugarcoat it. In one interview, he explained how he confronted the frauds. "I tell them, you're a fake, you're a fraud, and you're an imposter." And he pushed for real consequences, lobbying successfully to increase penalties for people who falsely claimed the medal or sold it as if it were just another collectible. Think about that for a second. A man who had stood in the mud on Guadalcanal for 13 hours, who had watched friends die around him while he kept a single ridge from collapsing, spent his retirement years hunting people who pretended to have done something even remotely similar. He didn't do it because he liked dragging people into court. He did it because each fake medal, each counterfeit story, felt like an insult to 32 dead Marines on one forgotten hill. And yet, his life after the war wasn't just consumed by anger. In 1998, toy company Hasbro released a 12-inch G.I. Joe figure modeled on Colonel Mitchell Paige as the Marine representative in a Medal of Honor series. Kids who had never heard of Guadalcanal suddenly had a box in their hands with his name on it, a small booklet explaining what he had done. He became a special liaison for the Congressional Medal of Honor Society to the FBI, dedicating years of his life to tracking down imposters and people selling counterfeit medals of honor. When reports came in about someone claiming to wear the medal, or about stacks of them being sold like trinkets at gun shows, Paige dug in. He checked names against official rosters. He quizzed suspected fakes about units, dates, places, details that real recipients never forgot and frauds always seemed to blur. When he found a liar, he didn't sugarcoat it. In one interview, he explained how he confronted the frauds. "I tell them, you're a fake, you're a fraud, and you're an imposter." And he pushed for real consequences, lobbying successfully to increase penalties for people who falsely claimed the medal or sold it as if it were just another collectible. Think about that for a second. A man who had stood in the mud on Guadalcanal for 13 hours, who had watched friends die around him while he kept a single ridge from collapsing, spent his retirement years hunting people who pretended to have done something even remotely similar. He didn't do it because he liked dragging people into court. He did it because each fake medal, each counterfeit story, felt like an insult to 32 dead Marines on one forgotten hill. And yet, his life after the war wasn't just consumed by anger. In 1998, toy company Hasbro released a 12-inch G.I. Joe figure modeled on Colonel Mitchell Paige as the Marine representative in a Medal of Honor series. Kids who had never heard of Guadalcanal suddenly had a box in their hands with his name on it, a small booklet explaining what he had done. The men who didn't get ceremonies. The men who didn't get retirement, or museums, or action figures, or late Eagle Scout badges. The men whose last view of Earth was the underside of leaves on a dark jungle ridge, while artillery flashed overhead and machine guns shook the ground under their elbows. Whenever people tried to press him to talk about his own heroism, Paige deflected. The medal, he insisted, belonged to the whole platoon. He just happened to be the one still breathing when the shooting stopped. That attitude tells you everything about why he fought as he did, and why he spent decades afterwards protecting the honor that medal represented. Remember, there were plenty of rational points in those 6 hours where a human body would have said, enough. When his hand was torn open, when machine guns jammed, when his ammo ran low, when the flank broke through, when the numbers were simply wrong and the odds were just bad enough to justify retreat. But Marines aren't trained to do math in those moments. They're trained to make decisions based on something else entirely, duty to the man next to you and to the men behind you who can't afford to have the line collapse. For Paige, those men behind weren't just the Marines sleeping in foxholes closer to the airfield. They were also the nameless bomber crews on Henderson's runway, the ships offshore, and the families back in Pennsylvania and across America who didn't even know there was a ridge on Guadalcanal with their future on it. You can call what he did adrenaline, or training, or psychological focus. All of that is true. But there was another ingredient that doesn't fit neatly into manuals or after-action reports, meaning he had watched 32 Marines under his command fall around him. As long as he could still pull a trigger, as long as there was one belt left, he could make sure those deaths counted for something. Not glory, not headlines, just a ridge that held, and an airfield that stayed in American hands. That's why he spent his retirement chasing down people who lied about wearing the Medal of Honor, because to him, the medal was made of more than metal. It was made of names of men who never got to grow old, who never got to hear a bugler at their funeral because there weren't enough men left to form a firing party on that particular stretch of ground. It's easy, in the age of digital everything, to let stories like this fade into background static. There are a million videos, a billion distractions. A ridge on Guadalcanal can feel as far away as another planet. But here's the truth. The life you're living right now exists in part because, on a dark, miserable night in 1942, one exhausted 4-year-old Marine refused to give up a position he should not have been able to hold. He was not perfect. He was not superhuman. He was tired, hurt, scared, and angry, and he kept fighting anyway. If this story hit you even a little, do something with it. Don't just let it wash over you like another war tale you half remember tomorrow. Scroll down and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family ever served Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or any other uniform. That one small act turns this from a video into a living memory. Every like you leave tells the algorithm, don't bury this. Show this to someone else who's scrolling in silence and doesn't know this ridge ever existed. Every share is one more person who learns that Guadalcanal wasn't just a word in a textbook, but a place where 33 Marines on one stretch of ground bent the arc of the entire Pacific War. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're digging out stories like this from dusty archives and fading documents, not to glorify war, but to make sure real courage, quiet, stubborn, often forgotten, doesn't vanish. Mitchell Paige is gone. The 32 Marines who died on that ridge are gone. Whether their memory stays or disappears into the noise, that part is on us now.